This week, I will continue discussing the age of absolutism with the rise of the Kingdom of Prussia in northern Germany. Starting out as a small German state ruled by the Hohenzollern dynasty, it rose to prominence under the leadership of King Frederick the Great, famously known as the Old Fritz. Prussia later became the prototype state to the German Empire and the later modern Germany today. This lecture starts now. So the Kingdom of Prussia, of course, national anthem. That was the original national anthem, of course, before other anthems, of course, in Germany today. So, welcome you back, Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College. Hope everybody's had a great weekend overall. Of course, going into week 6 for this History 1123 online class. So, hope everybody had a great weekend, pretty much. So, looks like, of course, we got a bunch of students watching live. I know right now. I know Brianna joined us pretty much early on. Hey, Brianna, good morning. Lulu also joined us too early this morning as well, along with Destiny. Also coming in, looks like we have Joshua. Hey, what's up, Joshua? What's going on? Ashlyn, hey, what's going on? Of course, also Steph. Hey, what's up? And also Courtney. And then it looks like we've got a few other people joining in too. Brittany and also Samaria as well. So, anyway, of course, get kind of going today. Of course, I will be kind of wrapping up the Age of Absolutism lectures. I've got today, I'll kind of talk about the rise of Prussia. And then later in the week on Wednesday, I'll get into also the rise of Russia. So kind of talk about both those states that kind of arise in, early modern Europe. These, of course, lectures on the Age of Absolutism will go towards, of course, the first exam coming up, which, of course, I will announce on Wednesday. So should have an announcement coming up on that, pretty much, which will be due sometime in October. I know assignments right now. I'll kind of talk about that real quick, but I know we have the Reformation quiz that's still out due later in the week. So that's an assignment that I'm not sure when that'll do exactly. Probably a few days this week. I'll probably give you extra time on that if you need it. I don't think I've pushed it back yet, but that's one of our main assignments I know we have out. And I know we have the second vocab coming up later, I think in October. That's also going to be due as well. So kind of talking about all the different assignments that I'm going to have coming up, along with, of course, the new first exam and all that. All right. So anyway, today, like I said, I'm going to get to, of course, talking about the rise of Prussia, which Prussia was this German state that emerged in northern Germany, north kind of like in northern Europe. And of course, very famous for rulers like Frederick the Great, who you see over my shoulder. Frederick the Great, probably one of their greatest rulers, definitely the longest reigning monarch, of course, of the state. So we'll talk a lot about Prussia. I'll kind of also talk a little bit later also about the rise of the German Empire, because that's going to eventually evolve by the late 19th century, which Prussia kind of helps to kind of birth, of course, later. I'll talk about kind of what happens to Germany later, just a little bit for, I guess, until we get to that later in the 19th and 20th centuries. So if you have a comment, question during the live stream, let me know. Or you can always leave a comment on my channel. You can also subscribe to my channel, of course, as well. So, yeah, I'm going to get to, of course, the main thing, talking about the rise of Prussia. Prussia, like I said, was this state that, like I said, merged in northern Germany. They kind of came out of the whole part of their state came out of the Holy Roman Empire. It's got all kinds of names, of course, that they call the Prussian state, like Prussia or Brandenburg-Prussia, which I'll also mention was the other name that it was also called. It was ruled by this dynasty called the Hohenzollern dynasty, or House of Hohenzollern, which was also called House of Brandenburg-Prussia sometimes. It was called multiple names, but Hohenzollern is the common name they usually call it. Uh, the name Prussia, it's kind of been around going back to almost like Middle Ages. There's different theories or origins of where the word Prussia came from. Like there's at least two theories they have. The main thing was that if you know about Germany or parts of Germany, it was kind of settled by or helped develop by the Teutonic Knights in northern Germany, which were really some of the best soldiers that were in the German armies in northern Europe. And they were sometimes called the Old Prussians. And so hence the name Prussia kind of evolved from that name. There's another theory that it evolved from the fact that people call the Vikings that invaded into northern Europe, they called them the Rus or Russ. And then the ones in Germany may have been called Pruss. So there's another theory about that, about the origins of, about where it came from. So there's Frederick the Great. And of course, they do kind of incorporate like the eagle, which, a lot of other states kind of do in modern Europe at the time. I'll get to it later, but they had the Kingdom of Prussia. They'll rise up in the 18th century. You can see Prussia was a kingdom from 1701 to 1918. But Prussia does exist, by the way, as part of Germany up to like the Third Reich in World War II. So I'm going to get into and talk about that. They, of course, have a castle that's very famous in Germany. It's called Hanzaran Castle, which is in the area of Baden-Württemberg, Germany. And that's believed to be the origin of where the name Hohenzollern came from, like from the actual. And I told you how all these different dynasties have, their dynasties named after castles, and like, House of Windsor or Habsburg, etc. And so same thing with that. And I think it's been rebuilt multiple times. I think that castle that you're looking at, which is it's actually on a little mountain called Mount Hohenzollern, and so hence the name being, of course, used later. But here's kind of a map of the area, all of Europe, that you're kind of looking at least up to 1740 in the 18th century. So you can see Prussia was called different names. Prussia, later is the name they start using later. Originally, it was called Brandenburg Prussia because it was composed of two states that were together. And part of it was because those two states were kind of formed from an intermarriage, like the two kind of married each other. And so hence the name was kind of used starting around the 17th century. And then by the 18th century later, they would drop the word Brandenburg and just simply use the word just Prussia alone. And It's hard to see in that map. I do have some other maps showing you the area there. Here's kind of a map showing the Hohenzollern state that would be Prussia later. So yeah, it was composed of different areas. Mostly there's two main areas that it was part of. They had one area that was called the Duchy of Prussia. So the ruler was called the Duke of Prussia. And they had the other state, and by the way, that area was in the area that's kind of like in the eastern part of that map, which would be, they call it later East Prussia. And it's like actually part of Poland now, but it used to be above Poland. And then the area in the center where it says Brandenburg, that area was either called the Electorate of Brandenburg, or they had another name they called it, which is called the Margravate, which they called it that because some of the early leaders of that area of Brandenburg had a medieval title called a Margrave, which was a type of military commander who defended the border provinces of the Holy Roman Empire, because Brandenburg was a state that was within the Holy Roman Empire, but Prussia was not. It was outside of it. By the way, the Elector of Brandenburg, which is one of the later names they really start using, was an important prince within the Holy Roman Empire. He was one of like 7 prince electors that would elect the Holy Roman Emperor, which was not a traditional hereditary type, noble title. It was elected, although the Habsburgs, for 300-400 years, ruled pretty much over it. Later, it would have up to 10 at one point, but that's why that state was kind of deemed important, of course, later. Here's another map showing you what the Kingdom of Prussia, that's the original state. It started out East Prussia, of course, now in Poland, northern Poland today. And it had a capital, which you see there, which was the city of Königsberg, which Königsberg is not Königsberg anymore. It was taken over by the Soviets later after World War II. And it's now called Kaliningrad. You know about that. But both states had separate capitals. So capital Brandenburg is Berlin, which is now the capital of Germany today, the Federal Republic of Germany. And then the capital of Prussia, like I told you, is called Königsberg. But it wasn't the largest city in that area. It was actually Danzig. It was actually larger. Yeah. Kaliningrad is now kind of controlled by the Russians, if you know about that. Now, I'll get into it and talk about some of the early rulers that were famous with Prussia. One of the first that they usually talk about, especially going back to the 17th century, is a ruler named Frederick William. He was often called the Great Elector. You can see kind of a better picture of him right there. He was called the Great Elector because of the fact that he was not just a great political leader, but he was also a great military mind as well. And a lot of course, historians on Germany consider Frederick William to be the father of Prussia. He's the one that kind of put the state on a footing to becoming, a kingdom later. It wouldn't become that until after he dies. But he's one of the first ones that really, start to do that. And he's actually kind of starts putting Prussia on a footing to becoming kind of an absolutist type state, which will have some of the rulers that will kind of reign like that. And one of the things he's known for doing, which the Prussians are very famous for, if you know about it, is their military traditions. That's one thing about Prussia. They were very, very famous for having great soldiers. A lot of states wanted to actually hire German mercenaries, if you know about that, to fight in many wars. And a lot of the German nobility were ruled by these. The ones that ran the army were these German nobility that were called the Junkers. They were dubbed. And these were landed aristocrats who owned like the majority of the Prussian land that was maintained by the peasants back in those days. And the word Junker, it's pronounced with a Y, means in German young lord. So a lot of them will have a if you know about this, a nobiliary particle in their name, like which is von, etc. And so a lot of the, if you go back to when they get into like the all the different wars that they're in. A lot of the great generals, of Prussia were often, got the title von in their name. So that's going to eventually lead to the rise of, so yeah, here you go. Here, right here, he's going to develop a standing army. That's one of the things that he starts to do. Frederick William, which I think before that they relied on mercenaries. And during like the 30 Years' War and afterwards, Prussia starts to create kind of a military type state, which they're kind of known for in the future, especially by the time they get into the 18th century. Yeah, for sure. But this ruler here, King Frederick the First, he's really considered to be pretty important. He's the one who forms the Prussian state into a kingdom, which I told you, Kingdom of Prussia was founded in 1701. It lasts till 1918. You can see there were 9 rulers at one point that ruled over the Kingdom of Prussia, or later the German Empire, as they called it, which the last 3 were German emperors, which were called a Kaiser, or Kaisers. And if you know about the Prussian monarchs, they reigned from Potsdam. That was actually the capital of the state of Brandenburg. And later, Berlin, the capital will later be the capital of Prussia and Germany. Later on, it will be. But most of the monarchs, Frederick the Great or whatever, reigned from Potsdam, from all those different palaces that they're known for, like Sanssouci, etc. He, by the way, was crowned. I think I got an image of that right here. He was crowned on January 18th, 1701. So that's deemed to be the date, I guess, when the Kingdom of Prussia was actually created as an actual state. So they were crowned in Königsberg, which I told you was the original capital of Prussia. And Frederick the First still had other titles. He was still known as the Duke of Prussia, and also I think that was his original title. Then became king, but he was still the electorate or elector, really elector of Brandenburg. So he kind of kept that other title that he had with Brandenburg. And really, if you study about the early Prussian kings, especially like the first 2 Prussian kings that come along, they're actually called King in Prussia. That's actually the original title they used before Frederick the Great changed it to King of Prussia, which will be a little later. So there's kind of an image, of course, showing King Frederick the First right there. I'll kind of talk about like why they were able to do this. By the way, there was a treaty that was issued with the Holy Roman Empire that was called the Crown Treaty, November 1700. And if you remember correctly, at the time, Emperor Leopold I was one of the greatest, rulers in Europe, kind of a rival to Louis XIV. Holy Roman Empire at that time recognized Prussia as an independent kingdom. Why did they do this? This was because the fact that there was an impending war that was about to break out, which I think I talked about this before. Talked about how in Spain, King Charles II didn't have any heirs. And so, remember correctly, he gave the throne to the Bourbon, Philip of Anjou, later became King Philip V of Spain. And that caused the whole, War of the Spanish Succession to break out because the Habsburgs wanted the throne back, and they didn't want the Bourbons to control, Spain have 2 big empires they control. And so that's why the Holy Roman Empire recognized Prussia, because the Prussians were promising to send forces to help out the Habsburgs. And so that's where all that came from, of course, and all that. Now, I think there was an alliance they had that formed, which the Germans were all forming, called the League of Augsburg, which Prussia joined. They later called it in Europe the Grand Alliance, and it fought against Louis XIV in Bourbon, France, and Bourbon, Spain, and all that to try to, prevent that. Which it did prevent them from joining, but the Bourbons still took control, of course, of Spain. All right, so kind of talking about that. Let me go ahead and talk about his son. He has a son too that was named Frederick William, who they called the Soldier King, who was very famous as well. He was this absolutist that took over Prussia in the early 18th century. They really consider him to be the most absolutist of the Prussian monarchs. Second Prussian king, you can see very conservative, of course, and like I said, very militaristic overall. We'll get to him later. He's kind of important. He's the father of Frederick the Great, who comes in later and becomes the king. Kind of talk about a few things about Frederick William the First, the Soldier King. He was famous for creating this Prussian military conscription system throughout Germany, which they used between the 18th and the 19th centuries. It was called the canton system. And basically, what they did was they divided Prussia into recruiting districts, which is called a canton. And each canton was responsible for raising one regiment. And so this basically enabled Prussia to amass a huge army within a few decades. And so by the time he died, Frederick William I, Prussia had the fourth largest army on the continent of Europe. That's pretty amazing. This is out of a population, by the way, in Europe at the time that was only 13th percentile population-wise. That's amazing. And so a lot of people were in the military. I think in Prussia, I think the total amount of men that were in the military was somewhere between 3 and 4%. To kind of give you an idea. United States, it's like 0.5% of the population is actually in the military. So that's amazing how many men that were in it. And so Prussia starts to be this military society, that they're kind of known for, military traditions that really go up to, like, I guess, World War I, World War II. And there's an old saying that they used to say about Prussia, which I'll kind of share with you, but they would say, Prussia is not a state that possesses an army, but an army that possesses a state. And so it's definitely an example of Prussian militarism, which they were kind of known for, and everybody wanted to, recruit these soldiers and use it. Napoleon used them, if you know about that, in his armies. I think when the American Revolution was going on, I know the British hired a bunch of German soldiers to go over there and fight against us and all that. And there was even German soldiers that fought on George Washington's side, of course, in that conflict as well. Oh, yeah, here's examples of some famous Prussian officers that were in their military. Von Steuben, Blücher, Clausewitz, von Moltke the Elder. You may have heard of him. Hindenburg, probably one of the greatest, Paul von Hindenburg, probably one of the greatest German generals of all time, going back to World War I. Erich Ludendorff, Erich von Falkenhayn. You may have heard of all these different German, officers, generals. They go back to the Prussian traditions and all that, militarily wise. Another thing about him that's kind of famous, he had this special regiment that he kind of formed that's well known, called the Potsdam Giants, were also nicknamed the so-called Longfellows. It was a special infantry regiment of taller than average soldiers. In fact, it had an official name, the Prussian Infantry Regiment Number 6. And it was composed of about 3,200 men. And to be in this special regiment, you had to be a minimum height of 6'2", which the average man, in Europe at the time was probably 5'6", to give you an idea. I'm 6'2". So I guess I could get in there, sneak in there. But some of those soldiers were huge, like 7'1", and I think he was 5'3". Frederick William I himself. And so it's kind of like I guess it was kind of like an Imperial Guard or something like that, kind of like what Napoleon will have later and all that. And he even had a mascot, which was a bear. So it's kind of interesting about that, but they couldn't be used in battle because the men were just huge and all that. And some guys, like I said, were almost 7 feet tall. So something he was kind of known for. I guess all these other Imperial Guards kind of spread later because of that. Now, his son is Frederick the Great, who, of course, we'll talk a lot about today, really the greatest Prussian monarch overall. Frederick the Great, of course, was often, if you know about this nickname, the Old Fritz, which not because he was old. We got old later, but it was more of a terms of endearment. The Germans called him, he's our guy, or our Frederick, I guess. And he's definitely the longest reigning, 46 years or so. He reigned in power. Although early on, he and his father did not get along. His father was very harsh to him, if you know about that. Almost had him killed, like court-martialed him, killed. I'll kind of talk about that later, what happened in his early life. He didn't get along at all with his father. I think his father even beat him or something like that. I remember reading about. But he's definitely very famous because of the fact that, Frederick the Great is known as this enlightened despot that was known for making a lot of reforms to Prussia to try to modernize. He's trying to modernize the state, make it like other modernized powers like in the West. And he preferred this title that he went by, which was the first servant of the state. So he felt like he was there as a king to serve the people. In fact, he said, a king is the first servant and the first magistrate of the state, is, I think, his famous comment he made about that. Another thing, too, I'll get to later, he's one of the first to really combine the lands together and all that of Prussia, because Prussia was really not made up of one state, but many nearby lands. And he's going to connect everything to make it one continuous kingdom. But yeah, his early life was pretty rough if you read about Frederick the Great. And They had this incident in his early years in 1730, which was called the Von Katta affair. You may have heard about this. And he had this friend who was in the Prussian military. Uh, there's been some speculation about, about Frederick's sexual orientation. Some claim he was gay, but maybe they're not sure about that, or maybe just doesn't care. But he had this friend named Von Katta who I don't know, they may have had an affair or something. They're not sure about that, but they tried to run away. I think to England, I think it was. His father caught him, and I think he was going to court martial his son and have him executed for trying to flee. He's the heir to the throne. And so what he did instead was he had his friend executed in front of him. Just made it basically cut his head off. And so he and his father never really got along, of course, overall. A few things, of course, about Frederick. I'll kind of talk about him. You can see kind of some things right there. Besides all of that, he was known for being kind of a military genius. I guess I'll talk about that first. Overall, he is kind of famous for developing this thing called the oblique order. You may have heard about that became popular. A lot of people kind of compared Frederick the Great to like a Napoleon Bonaparte because he's kind of like the statesman and military mind that's kind of well known. And I think I'll kind of show it right down here what it is with the where's the oblique order? I think it's right. Is that it? Yeah, there it is right there. The so-called oblique order. It's a type of military tactic that where an army attacks an enemy on its single flank, like say a left flank or right flank. And so he actually did this at the Battle of Leuthen during the 7 Years' War, which is one of his, I guess, most famous conflicts he was involved in later. And so with a smaller army, which I think was like 40,000, he was able to beat a larger Austrian army that was like double his size. And so that kind of tactic became popular later. They think that this idea came from the ancient Greeks a long time ago that used it a long time ago. And he kind of started using it. And I guess Napoleon and others also used it later as well. So anyways, kind of talking about that issue right there. Other reforms you can see there, he was also known for. He did give a lot of people in Prussia like more rights, like religious rights, like Catholics and Jews, which were kind of a minority in Prussia. They were given religious freedom, and so you do start to see, between the 18th and 19th centuries, especially Jews becoming emancipated in Germany. So you do see that later as well. Also, serfdom, he abolished that. He abolished torture, things like that. Those are all kind of reforms that the Habsburg monarchy were kind of doing to the south. And so he copied them also as well. He reformed their civil law code system. He had like a law code system that was called the Frederican Code that was developed after he died. They started working on it, I think, during his reign. And it was heavily influenced. A lot of these modern law codes, like the Napoleonic Code, are heavily influenced by the Justinian Code, which went back to Byzantine Roman times. And so he starts to do that also as well. He also reformed education, just like they were doing in other states like Habsburg monarchy. The 1760s, they start also compulsory education, not just for males, but for also women, young girls as well. And the Germans were known for developing different types of schools, which were really copied by other states later. Which, if you know about the Germans, they broke down schools into like different types of secondary education, like the real school, which was more for people that were just going to do a trade or a skill, right? Basically, and then they also developed the college preparatory schools, are starting to develop too, gymnasium where they continue for several years to prepare for college, higher education and things like that. And that's something that the Germans start to do, and other states copy that later in Europe and I guess other parts of the world. But anyway, kind of talking about some of the things that Frederick the Great was kind of known for overall. So yeah, he was reform minded. And of course, I'll show you in this map here. Like I was talking about, one thing that he's very, very famous for, Frederick the Great, not just making them a modern power at the time, but yeah, he's the one that really starts to connect all of the German lands. You see from East Prussia to Brandenburg, and then what's going to happen, about this, is that he's going to push southward. He's going to take over Silesia. He'll take that, and then we see kind of like where it says Magdeburg right there in the middle of that map. You also take Saxony. You'll start adding that into Germany as well, and expanding, the actual kingdom of Prussia. He is the first ruler, by the way, to use the title King of Prussia. So he starts to kind of use that, and so all that whole area is now Prussia, of course, instead of just that East Prussia part where the Duchy of Prussia originated. Now, when he came to power, there was this other monarch in the south we talked about, which was Maria Theresa, which, of course, the Habsburg monarchy that had come to power because of the Pragmatic Sanction. Remember back in 1713. Here's kind of an image, of course, of those two rulers. So, yeah, you got these two monarchs that come in at that point. Frederick had this idea, by the way, to marry her when he first became the ruler of Prussia in 1740. However, she didn't like him because what happened, I told you, was that one of the things that occurred right after Frederick comes in, he reneges on the Pragmatic Sanction. I think Prussia and Frederick William I had agreed that Maria Theresa could rule the Habsburg monarchy, but he reneged on it. He decided that this was an opportunity. He thought she would be a weak ruler. And so he invaded into Silesia, which is close where Bohemia is, like I guess right above it. It's now part of Poland. And so that sparked a series of wars in Europe that were called either, the Germans called it the Silesian Wars, fighting over Silesia. But in Europe, they call it the War of the Austrian Succession, which didn't end until the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. But it had gone for 8 years, 1740 to 1748. And interesting about this war, when the war broke out, these were the sides. Prussia was backed by the French, and then Austria was backed by Britain. So that was kind of like the actual balance of power of alliances at the time. And part of why Frederick the Great wanted Silesia was because Silesia had a lot of natural resources that were there. So we got coal, copper, iron ore, zinc, those kind of things. That's going to be important to the Prussian or German, military, like in their war machines and all that. And that's part of why, if you study about World War II, why the Germans were able to kind of survive even up to the end of the war, because the Allies couldn't bomb it because it was so far deep into Europe, that area. So all those different, natural resources are kind of important. But most of that area now is controlled by Poland. of course, today. So that's the only thing about that issue, of course. Yeah, there, of course, Frederick the Great. That's later on, kind of Battle of Leuthen. Of course, 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War. That'll be another war. That'll be kind of important because they do think that the whole issue over, Silesia and Saxony, those are issues that later lead to, of course, the 7 Years' War breaking out in the 1750s. Um, I think Maria Theresa in Habsburg monarchy wanted Silesia back. Frederick the Great also wanted Saxony. And so when Frederick the Great invaded Saxony, that really is one of the major events that sparked, of course, the 7 Years' War in Europe. Also, I think the French and the British were fighting in, about this in North America. So those are kind of major events that'll kind of lead to why that occurred later. But I probably won't talk much about the 7 Years' War today because I'll kind of get to that later when I get more to the French and the British. Yeah, those two did not like each other. I think I may have mentioned this before, but I think it was Maria Theresa had said to one of her advisors, saying something like "that evil man" was the quote. She refused to say his name, Frederick the Great. So yeah, those are eventually those areas you can see there in that map. Yeah, Saxony and Silesia; those are two main areas that Prussia eventually, take control of and add to their state. Later in Poland, in the 18th century, it'll eventually collapse as a state. The Prussians will come in and take part of that too, of Western Poland. That'll kind of add that to Prussia. It'll get bigger and bigger. Another thing I want to talk about that was interesting that occurred, of course, in Europe. They had this thing that occurred after the war, the Austrian secession, which was the so-called diplomatic revolution, which happened, they think, in the 17 by the 1750s. And you had this case where the alliances all switched after Frederick caused this war, of course, in Europe. And what happened was the alliance systems, which it kind of changed the whole balance of power in Europe. But Britain, um, remember um, Britain had been with the those two together. Austria switched from Britain to France. So you get this case where those two align together. Then Britain, is Hanover. I'll get to the House of Hanover, which controls Britain at the time in the 18th century. Those two are together, and so Austria is kind of switched to the French. And so what happens is the British switch to ally with the Prussians, which makes sense because you know uh, those three, Hanover dynasty ruling England and Germany and Prussia, they're all Germans. And so that makes all sense that they all kind of align together. And so for a long time, the Prussians and Austria don't like each other. This goes up until I think up to the middle late uh, part of the 18th century. And so it's going to later lead to why Prussia emerges to kind of form Germany because they kind of pushed the Austrians out and all that. So I'll get to that later. We won't talk about it, right now, all that stuff. But when I get to the 7 Years' War, I'll kind of talk more about what that is with that because that's going to be kind of vital with the 7 Years' War later. Of course, Frederick the Great is also known for his palaces that he constructed. He had like at least two main palaces that he built during his reign. One there you can see there is the palace called Sanssouci, which is well known. Kind of images of Sanssouci right there, and that was actually where he liked to hang out with us, his buddies that he had there. That was like his personal residence. Frederick the Great. He didn't want to have any women around or anything like that. Weird, but yeah, and then he also had this other palace he constructed as well during his reign. There's the grave of Frederick the Great, which is on that site. That's at Potsdam, outside Berlin. And then, of course, the new palace at Potsdam is also very famous as well. Much larger palace that he constructed during his reign. So a lot of the monarchs, I guess early monarchs in Prussia, kind of reigned from some of these palaces that are being built in Potsdam, uh, outside Berlin, Germany. There's another image, of course, that. Of course, they had this very famous painting of Frederick the Great, by the way, which was done by Anton Graf. It was done in 1781. They say it's the most famous painting ever done of Frederick the Great. The most accurate one. I think Adolf Hitler was obsessed with it. If you know about this, he kept it in his bunker. I think until his death. I guess when he shot himself in the head, it was probably like right behind him, that kind of thing. And so, like I said, the term "Old Fritz" is more of a terms of endearment. Like of course, a lot of Germans or Frederick were called Fritz. About that common German name overall. But yeah, that Frederick the Great became this legendary figure in Germany later, and he's still idolized today. If you know about him overall. Now, the only thing about Frederick, he did not have any children. That was the only thing about it. He bore no heirs. He had a wife. Most you don't know that. He was married to this woman named Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick. But like I said, he was reportedly, they think he was gay, which is kind of debated today about whether that's true or not. He never really liked his wife either. In fact, they think it was because his father had forced him to marry her. And so and then maybe like guys, I don't know. This is kind of debated still about that whole issue about his sexual orientation or whatever. But because of the fact that that was the case, eventually what happened was the throne, eventually went to one of his nephews. What is current. So I'll kind of get into it and talk about that. I'll kind of talk about the so-called later rulers of Prussia that reigned, into I guess the 19th and up to the 20th century. We'll kind of talk about that also as well, because you have the German Empire that occurs. Here's kind of two rulers that kind of rule overall early on. They have Frederick William II, and then Frederick William III. That would be like the nephew and grandnephew, basically, of Frederick the Great. The one on the left is famous. He's the one that first came in that inherited the throne after his uncle died, Frederick the Great. He reigned from 1786 to 1797. He's very famous for constructing, the one on the left is famous for constructing the Brandenburg Gate, which is probably one of the most famous tourist spots maybe in modern Berlin today. It was also kind of famous because that's kind of where the Berlin Wall went right there. In fact, that gate was on the East Berlin side, but it's very famous. It's kind of like considered like one of the main entrances into the city at one point, and so that's kind of why it's famous overall. Then the one on the right, who is Frederick William III, he was famous because he was the main ruler that ruled during the Napoleonic age. Like 1797 to 1840 is when he ruled as the King of Prussia. And yeah, he had to reign during Napoleon's time, and Napoleon, was just conquering all of Europe at the time. And one point, Prussia was almost absorbed into uh, the Napoleonic Empire, or at least forced to be an ally of theirs. And so, but he's going to be important later. Frederick William III does have kind of play a key later in restoring Europe after Napoleon is exiled, because will be eventually exiled permanently in 1815. And so he'll be at the Congress of Vienna. We'll get to that later. We talk about the age of Napoleon, and he'll kind of help to kind of redraw the map of Europe and change it and all that. And so that's kind of why he was kind of important as a ruler. But yeah, he kind of reigned at a bad time, of course, overall. Then they have another ruler later, King Frederick William IV. He was the son of Frederick William III. He's kind of an important monarch later of Prussia because of the fact that he begins to kind of convert the kingdom into a constitutional monarchy in the mid 19th century due to like all the revolutions of 1848 you may have heard of. A lot of states started to develop a constitutional monarchy where they had a parliament and people had right to vote, and you start seeing that kind of thing, kind of reforms being made throughout Europe overall. And so he's kind of considered the father of the constitutional monarchy they'll have for a while, which rules up to like World War One. Now later, what happens? Germany eventually becomes an empire, which will start. You'll see by the late 19th century. You get the rise of the German Empire, which the German Empire you can see reigned from 1871 to 1918, and they were ruled by these three emperors, which were called a Kaiser. You can see them right there: Kaiser Wilhelm the First, King Kaiser Frederick the Third, and then Kaiser Wilhelm II, probably the most famous one of the three overall. How did this come about? By the way, it was mostly a type of state that formed because of the fact that Germany was starting to push the Austrians out. I'll kind of get to maybe when I get to the post-Napoleon era, I'll talk about the German. They have this thing called the German Confederation that was created after they exiled Napoleon, and it was like it was kind of like this early German state that included like Germany, Austria that were in it. But what ended up happening was Germany, in Germany, Prussia and Austria got involved in a big war, which was called they call it all kinds of names. I think it was called the Austro-Prussian War or something like that, was what it was nicknamed later. But those two would get into war in 1866, and the Prussians would push the Austrians out of the German Confederation, and they would create this state called the Northern German Confederation, or I think it also called the North German Confederation. And it was a prototype state to the German unified state today. And so within like 4 years, it became a unified state in 1871. But actually, there was one more thing I'll kind of talk about later. I'll get to when I get to that period in the 19th century. But they'll have this thing called the Franco Prussian War that broke out too, where the Prussian German state, Northern German Confederation, fought France, which the Second French Empire at the time, which was ruled by Emperor Napoleon III, and the Germans defeated the French forces in that war, in the Franco Prussian War, and so that allowed the Germans to kind of unify their state into one empire and all that. And so the empire was called all kinds of names. We'll kind of get to it later about how they formed it really in Paris, like in Versailles, with the, I think it was in the Hall of Mirrors. I'll get to later about that. But Germany becomes this state which was called all kinds of names. From 1871 to 1918. People sometimes call it in the West German Empire or German Reich, which the word Reich could mean either empire or realm. Some people call it the Second Reich because the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, Third Reich was Nazi Germany and all that. And then simply just Germany or Deutschland or Fatherland. Of course, there's the common names. Of course, they also call it later as well. But yeah, if you study about later, when I get to the 19th century, the German Empire was actually founded in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles after the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War in January of 1871. And so what happened was Wilhelm I, who we were talking about earlier, became Kaiser Wilhelm. He was actually the King of Prussia originally, which I think he kept that title too. They have both the title. They have the King of Prussia and also Emperor of Germany. And so from 1871 to 1888, he's the first Emperor of Germany. Of course, that rules over the state. I'll get to him later. He is known as, kind of go back to that picture right there, the one on the left. He is later known sometimes as Wilhelm the Great, Kaiser Wilhelm I. If you know about him, he is very famous for appointing the first Chancellor of Germany. What you see on the bottom there is Otto von Bismarck, who was known simply as the Iron Chancellor. We'll get more into him in the 19th century too. He's very famous. They think that really Otto von Bismarck is considered the one that was the brains behind the whole unification of Germany and how it came about in the late 19th century. Now, they also have some other rulers, which you see. The one in the middle is Frederick the Third. Frederick the Third was the second Kaiser or second Emperor of Germany. He apparently had cancer. He was the son of Kaiser Wilhelm the First, and he only reigned like 3 months in 1888. And so it's really weird about this, but in 1888 they had this deal happen where there were actually three emperors that reigned over Germany. It was called the so-called Year of the Three Emperors. And so at one point, Wilhelm the First, Frederick the Third, and Wilhelm the Second all reigned the same year. It's kind of weird about that. But the one on the far right, of course, the one I guess that ends up being the most famous one. You have the son of Frederick the Third, which is Wilhelm the Second. And he's the last Kaiser they have, of course, who reigns from 1888 to 1918. He's famous for really being the ruler when World War I breaks out. Some people blame him for the war sometimes. In fact, he's going to abdicate, if you know about that, when World War ends and the Germans end up losing, World War One. And so when Germany lost World War One, that's when the Hanzaran dynasty was forced to eventually abdicate the throne, and it ended their dynasty, which had reigned, like I said, they had almost been in power close to 400 years. If you go back to before they were a kingdom and all that. I'll kind of also share with you some other images, I guess, to show you. Later, they have other periods of German history that are kind of well known. They have the Weimar Republic that occurs from 1918 to 1933. Germany goes from being this constitutional monarchy to being a republic, republican type state. And Germany has a president and a chancellor. The president is like the head of the state, then the chancellor is the head of the government. That's pretty much traditionally what Germany has had since after World War One. Is a chancellor that pretty much heads up the government. And of course, the president is more like a PR type position rather than real actual political power and all that. Then later, of course, we'll get to it. You have a Nazi period from 1933 to 1945 when the Nazis under Adolf Hitler take over Germany. That's going to be important later because that's going to later lead into World War II. We'll get to that later when we get to the 20th century. Talk about that, but that's a period that the Germans kind of want to forget about. I know they sometimes even can't even talk about it, stuff like that. I know in the modern state of Germany today, but that's something we'll kind of get to when we do later in the semester. And then, of course, you got the Cold War era. You know about what happened. Germany after the war was split into two states. You have West Germany and East Germany. They even split up, of course, Berlin. You had West Berlin and East Berlin and all of that. And I think it's an image shown during the so-called Berlin airlift, which helped to kind of divide Germany. And so Germany was kind of divided later into all these different occupation zones where the Allies occupied Western Germany, like Britain, France, and the United States, and the Soviet Union occupied East Germany, and so was Berlin also as well. So this went on from pretty much after World War II up to like the early 1990s and all that. Then what happened. Germany reunified in the 1990s, early 90s. And so the modern German state today, you can see that map there, doesn't look like the old German state. The old German state had that Eastern Prussia part that they had as well, which a lot of that territory, then the part where Silesia and all that was lost, after World War II. That's the way Germany looks today, map wise, overall. And that's a kind of a modern picture you can see of Berlin right there. It gets downtown Berlin, etc. And so, the modern state of Germany, it's now a federal republic. It's actually a modern state which has 16 constituent states, kind of like we have a bunch of states. They have the same thing also as well. The current chancellor of Germany, by the way, is Olaf Scholz. He took over, by the way, last year. And so he's what heads up the government. And by the way, he takes over from Angela Merkel, who had been in power, you can see something like 16 years. She had been in power since I think close to 2005. So she was kind of real famous, if you know about her. So we'll have to see kind of what Olaf Scholz does. We don't really know much about him I guess right now, but we'll kind of see how he does as their main political leader and all that. So that kind of gives kind of a history, of the early German state, because Prussia is going to be important. Prussia is going to be the state that kind of leads into that, helped create the modern German state that we know today. Next week, I'll kind of be moving on. Actually, this week I'll be kind of moving on later into getting into the Russians. We have to talk about them too, which I know is kind of a controversial topic because of what's going on between Russia and the Ukrainians. So I'll kind of talk about the rise of Russia. Primarily, I'm going to talk about the rise of the czars, like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, who's one of their early great rulers that they have that helped to kind of lead into the modernized state of Russia. So we'll kind of get into that. And that's going to be kind of like the main last topic I'll have, of course, that'll be, of course, going into like that first exam. Because like I said, our first exam is going to be on pretty much all the lectures that I had on the Age of Absolutism. So that's pretty much what I'm having. I'm not really going to have basically other topics that I'll have on that exam. So I think I'm kind of dividing up the assessments into different formats and all that. Oh, by the way, YouTube sent me something that was kind of interesting the other day. They sent me this little GIF here because I guess I reached 1,000 subscribers. So that's kind of interesting about that. So I guess that is a lot of bananas, that kind of thing. So anyway, so y'all take care, and I'll see y'all later in the week. But don't forget about those other assignments out. I think the Reformation one is the main one y'all got out that y'all got to work on. And I'll try to send out some other emails, of course, about reminders in the week. So y'all take care and have a great rest of the week. Y'all take care.